Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I'd like to just begin by talking about what we mean by innovation, or what I mean by innovation, and how it associates with creativity, and how it associates really with how we live our lives. So I think it's helpful to think of this room, for example, as full of ideas, which of course in many ways it is, but even more concretely to think of every point in this room as representing an idea, and what differentiates these ideas is their level of impact. So if we think about me as being the set of all points of impact 0, as I move ideas out from me, I create impact of some degree. And so really what we do in our lives in part is to develop ideas, often in a very sort of trivial way. Occasionally we hold on to ideas for a pretty long time, and that could be simply because of a job we have, but often or sometimes it occurs that we're passionate about an idea, and even if it's not our job, we hold on to that idea. And what typically happens as we hold on long to an idea is that we reach a point where, in the process of developing that idea, we wake up in the middle of the night and we really don't know where to go next. We realize that we've sort of made our first move in the direction of realizing our idea, which could become the president of a company or to realize a work of art or science, none of which is very obvious. It's not as if we can get a book or we can ask somebody exactly how to do it, and so it's sort of we sort of experimentally move our way towards realizing our objective. We wake up in the middle of the night and we're confused. These forks in the road, or these stumbling blocks, are often moments of embarrassment, moments of great confusion, significant loss of sleep, and ultimately pretty humbling moments. And there are some of us, maybe everybody in the room, at different moments in their lives, who love these moments. These moments where sort of paradoxically, where we're very young, we're sort of innocent, sort of don't know where we're going. These sort of blank sheet moments, if you think about serial entrepreneurs or serial novelists, this willingness and even urge to throw ourselves before the blank sheet of paper, even though we really don't know what we're going to fill that paper with, but realizing that somehow we're going to figure out what to do with that piece of paper. Those moments are sort of the key building blocks of innovation. Now, one of the points I'll make in the talk is that nevertheless, we sort of create our institutions, whether they're companies or museums or universities, by measuring trajectories of idea translations, when in reality what really is the motor of innovation, which is idea translation with some significant impact, are these moments. And what I argue is that what happens in these moments, the process of creative thought that happens in these moments, is incredibly universal. Whether I'm a banker or I'm an artist or I'm a scientist, there's, on the one hand, this sort of comfort with ambiguity, sort of thriving in uncertainty, this sort of ability to dream, this ability to be guided by images, but at the same time I get out of the crisis and I analyze and I deduce and I simplify a very complex situation to a sort of tractable problem, whether I'm an artist or a scientist or whomever I am. So this process is what I think of as a fusion of art, not art as an object, not science as a discovery or as a theorem, but art as we live it, the process of art, I do art, or science as we live it, I do science, as opposed to the outcome of science. Nevertheless, we tend to show art in our museums, in our books, in our popular culture as outcome, and science as outcome, but in reality we live it as process. And so it's that fusion of a very aesthetic method process and a very analytical, sort of scientific method process that I refer to as art science, and I develop in this book on creativity in the post-Google generation. My work tends to explore this space. If looked at, as I'll do really briefly, from a distance, it seems to be incoherent in terms of how it all kind of pulls together. But in a way, it's an effort to throw myself in front of this blank piece of paper. And so I do medical science work, which is my training, which I'll talk a little bit about. I write fiction, and I'm involved in art and design, and we have some consumer products, inhaled chocolate, for example, coming out soon. Now, one of the issues of doing anything that leads to impact is associating that crisis in your creative life that you sort of invited upon yourself, or maybe you didn't invite it, but if you're an innovative kind of person you sort of love, associating that with some crisis that matters broadly enough so that others actually share your passion. It's very hard to realize any idea of significant impact without being in a pretty collaborative mode. And so ultimately we learn, and all of us learn, to identify our passions with passions that matter. And in my medical science work, I trained in applied math and ultimately became involved in medical science work and ultimately in the resolution or the attempt to resolve diseases of poverty like AIDS, TB, and malaria. And so in our work, we are right now particularly focused on developing ways of delivering vaccines without having to inject them. About a third of needles in the developing world are dirty, and it's a major problem. The resolution, if you will, of this crisis was an invention of a certain kind of an aerosol. Now, what's interesting about that aerosol, which is a bunch of particles in the air. Normally when we make aerosols, we make them as little droplets. And so my idea was to make them as sort of wiffle balls, so very hollow sort of particles. And you can't say that that was a sort of a scientific method kind of idea, as if I 2 + 2 is 4 and therefore a porous particle. But with some sort of a drawing on my past, my childhood, obviously there was an analytical part of that, and so there was some sort of fusion of art and science. So just to leap ahead, through a reflection at Harvard University in the early 2000s, I became involved in thinking about how it is that we break down disciplinary barriers, which are often a major stumbling block to innovation and advancement, if not resource development, at the university. And it led to the concept of a sort of lab, which is going to be the main focus of my talk here. This lab, which is a place of where innovations are spawned at this interface between the arts and sciences, as I'll describe, is all about process. And so again, as you think about how we innovate, it's not really outcome. We're very rarely sort of holding the final report. Mostly we're in the process, and yet in thinking about this lab, we felt it was very important to invite the public in, to invite the public into process, and so my fiction writing, which I've done for many years, became associated in this particular case with inviting people to enter through fiction into the process of what we call the lab, which is pretty vague, but I'll come back to this here in just a minute. So I'd like to talk about a culture lab, which gets to the title of my talk. This art science process is what this space is about in Paris that we created. And in referring to culture, I should sort of define what I mean by culture. We all sort of receive a culture in our families, but then we move in and out of cultures throughout our lives. And so one way to think about it, or the way that is meaningful to me, is to think about culture as something that we receive. It's really how we live our lives, play, dream, believe. And ultimately, as we get older, we sort of wonder, what is our sort of most comfortable culture? And many times we actually live that culture through institutions. Institutions are obviously a major way in which society passes culture along. And that's good and often necessary today when it takes amazing resources to have a significant impact on the world today. And so it's often happening through institutions, even if we think about companies or the corporate sector as sort of institutional. But that's the positive side, and I'm involved at Harvard in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and I love my colleagues, and they're wonderful resources, and it's really essential. Nevertheless, there's a need today. One of the major problems facing all of us institutionally is that by virtue of the explosion of information and our need to absorb that information, institutionally we specialize. And specialization creates barriers that become obstacles to innovation. And so innovators often flee. So it makes us wonder, well, what is our culture? So my first idea is that it's sort of what's left to say after all the obvious things have been spoken, so it's sort of creative. I'm going to skip quickly because I see my time running here. it's sort of what's left to do after the obvious. It's not following steps that we've taken before. I enjoy being around, and maybe you do, those of us who really don't know what the next step is and sort of are maybe embarrassed about it, humbled by it, but we're young, and so it's experimental. It's a little bit more complex. It's kind of a universal possession derived from the resolution of a peculiar crisis, and so it's my own crisis, but I've found a way that it resonates broadly, and therefore it's in a way collaborative. And so if we accept that culture is this, at least it can be, this creative, collaborative, experimental process implicit in the resolution of a crisis, it is innovation. And it sort of happens at this interface between art and science. So we have created this lab, which is explained in the book, where we do 3 or 4 experiments a year. These are experiments that are driven fundamentally by artists. So we're looking for artists who are dreaming at a cutting edge of science and can't really develop that dream without having the presence of a scientist who sort of owns that interface. And so then we look to invest in a common dream that's driven ultimately by the artist or the designer. And the scientist may be a sounding board, he may be making or she may be making something, it doesn't really matter. We do different kinds of experiments that then are open to the public. We opened with an experiment with Fabrice Hibert, who's a very interesting French artist, who was interested in giving to the public the experience of being a stem cell, becoming a neuron. And so he worked with Bob Langer, who somebody I worked with at MIT, on developing an amazing art installation, at the center of which was this concept of falling through. If we all had the possibility of falling through an hourglass, that would somehow be tantamount to what it must feel like to undergo cellular division. And so at the center of this exhibition, there is this big, among other hourglasses. You could sort of fall through this polymer sleeve, and these little white beads ran up around you, and you had this moment of ultimate constriction as you were trying to fall through, and you fell through and came out on this mattress. Now, none of these people, of course, did that, but and our lawyers didn't really allow us to let anybody do it, but it was a really interesting, very abstract kind of thought. Similarly, we have an exhibition right now by Ryoji Ikeda, who's a really fascinating digital composer from Japan, thinking about the meaning of Cantor's set, which is a very, and ultimately infinity. Moving on, we do things that are much more practical, and so working with Mathieu Lano, developed with some collaboration with me, a new way of, we thought about it initially of making plants more intelligent, and it became a new design of an air filter, which is now being commercialized. We work with chefs, so we sort of convinced ourselves that cooking is also can be a kind of art, and we have been looking at this really fascinating interface between colloidal science and culinary art, and now have a food lab in the laboratoire, which is actually a great way from a culture center point of view. How do you get the public to enter into the process of innovation? And so actually food is a really great way. And so the inhaled chocolate came out of this. We have a big program in humanitarian engagement, partly because of my scientific work, where we work each year with a different artist around these issues of global health. And so our first project was Jim Naktwe, who did this really powerful work, which has now traveled to Bangkok. And so in general, we sort of fuse these two kinds of methods. And one of the things, being a professor at Harvard University, one of the things that really interests me is the educational value of this. How do you make a lab work, actually? You make it work by finding those who can invest in the process, because the value of the creative process, and so obvious value, is the educational value of students developing dreams at this interface that then could become new companies or not-for-profits or works of art. And so we have a workshop at the laboratoire at the end of the summer. We bring students from Harvard, young inner-city kids, and also from Paris and Dublin and elsewhere. And one of the things, just as a little, maybe a very important point to make, actually, after I started a company and sold a company in the late 90s, and then I came back to the university, partly having thought about whether I wanted to do that or not, by virtue of the fact that students, as maybe most of you know, keep us young, and particularly it's fascinating that this process I'm describing is very much a childish sort of process. Kids, I'm fascinated by freshmen at Harvard University. They might be a writer or they might be a physicist, and they really don't know, and they sort of decide at some point. And that ability to imagine themselves as this or that is fundamental once we specialize to our ability to bring value to our specialization. And so actually investing in kids' dreams is a big lesson. So the main thing I just want to maybe leave you with is this concept of art science, that it's fundamentally related to this idea translation, that as we develop ideas, big ideas, we tend to go in circles sometimes. It can take a long time. There's many frustrating moments. At the end of the day, when we realize the book or the new policy or whatever it is, we describe that idea translation by these points. It's not really, it's these points that really mark us, and it's at these points where this process of art science or this fusion of methods occurs. It's the kind of thing I try to communicate in these novels that are just, the second one is just coming out. And I guess if I were to capture from a sort of a workshop point of view the qualities of that culture in that frustrating moment, there's this ability to be uncertain and actually for those around us to accept that we don't know. There's this clear need and confidence to build on our experience as being relevant. It's this ability to communicate across disciplines, and ultimately it's this sort of passion to discover something new. I have 1 minute left. I think I've finished. Thank you very much. I don't know what the format is. I should take questions, but I'd be happy to do that. Thank you very much. Do you do questions? I'd be happy to answer any questions. There's a big group to actually pose questions, but you're welcome to. So maybe I'll just say, if nobody's going to ask a question, we have set up the laboratoires at not-for-profit. We've set up a for-profit next to it, which is a kind of incubator. We have a couple products that are coming out. The idea is sort of like an American research university to have very open-ended, not-for-profit at the core. And then if intellectual property or innovations come out, we protect them, spin them out, and then get them into the corporate sector. So we're not really based upon company investment, but we do work downstream. I probably have used up my time. Thank you very much.